So we're in your economics book and we're in chapter 7. We're going on to the fourth section in here is called the scale of production. And so let's look at this picture down here. Here we have Henry Ford with his first automobile in September 1896. So we're going to talk about Henry Ford here as an entrepreneur. So the scale of production. Economic efficiency improved by enlarging the size or the scale of the business operation, making the business a lot larger than they used to be. An example would be the automobile with Ford Motor Company. And so at the end of the 19th century, let's talk about Henry Ford here. Let's look at, here's a picture of him again, and we're going to talk about him. So Henry Ford with Ford Motor Company. At the end of the 19th century, Henry Ford was a machinist, and he was also the chief engineer of a highly developed company, Edison Illuminating Company, with light bulbs. So he worked in this company in Detroit. And so he also studied the early engines of automobiles that were developed in Germany and Britain and the United States as a hobby. So he's looking into automobiles. In 1899, he knew enough that he had enough capital to begin and maybe try to manufacture automobiles. So he formed the Detroit Automobile Company and made his first car, invented, well, now he didn't invent the car, but he put the first car in his small machine shop, put together his first car there. And then he, in doing this, he realized that he could do it. And so he thought, well, it took 3 months to assemble a car, so he put together some people to help him, some labor required to put together and to put together these cars. But the cars were so expensive at this time because they took quite a while to build, right? And he thought, as an entrepreneur, well, if I could lower my price, I bet you millions of people will want these cars. And so then he sought ways to reduce the average cost of his production in some way. And as an entrepreneur, he used his imagination. He went through some ideas that he got from others, and he developed what was the American system of mass production to mass produce these things. And here, up here, as you see, is what he put together. He put together the division of labor, specialization of labor. Each employee will do one part of making the car. Standardized parts. Basically, before they had custom parts, that each car was different, and now we would want to put standardized parts instead. And all the cars would be the same, right? And then he would have an automatic conveyance or assembly line some way so that they could put, as the assembly line went past, as they assembled things, they would assemble the same thing over and over. And this would be less labor per automobile. And also, even though the custom parts would not fit other cars if they had the right parts that were not custom. But a lot of people like custom parts, so that was kind of a detriment at the time. And prior to this, he had a team of workers, and he put them as the workers. They got together to make this entire car at this time, before this time, and they spent significant time moving around and hunting for parts and all this stuff. And he thought, well, this will prevent us from doing that. So my workers won't have to go hunt around for parts and lose a lot in time production. Instead they'll do the same thing over and over. And so now he would change this to the standardized parts of the assembly line, and the division of labor, again, has happened. So Ford cut down the time to make a car. So here's a picture of Henry Ford. So let's go on to the next here. It says, it has been my observation here that most people get ahead during the time that others waste. Because he realized that there was a lot of waste of time before this. So now in the assembly line, he decided that it wouldn't be so much of a waste. So Henry Ford centered on mass production at his Rouge plant in Detroit. and he became the biggest installation plant of this type in the world. So, one of the biggest at least. And he reinvested all of his projects then, and he steadily increased his outputs, making the factory business, his factory, larger and larger. And he was able to buy raw materials lower now, because in the midst of this, now he could buy by bulk. So he got his materials a lot cheaper. And then he built these assembly lines in various parts of the United States. He'd start in one town and he'd go to another town and build another assembly line so that he could reduce the cost of transportation to these other cities after he built these cars. So what was the result? Let's look down here. There's a picture. Result is that, isn't it? By devising an efficient system, mass production, Henry Ford paved the way for today's mobile society and automobiles. But let's talk about his costs here, and it's kind of written in here. I thought they had a chart, but in the early 1900s, Ford could only make 20 cars. You know, basically 20 cars in that time period. So, but in 1907, after he put this together, he was making 8,000 cars. Then in 1914, in that year, he made 250,000 cars. And so thousands of Model Ts went to the road. And people in 1924 could buy a car for only $260, which seemed a lot at that time, but it was a lot cheaper than it had been when he was making only 20 cars a year, right? And so now people were buying, and they were getting around all over with cars. Of course, they had to, now the United States had put together roads and highways for him. So he was a big entrepreneur. So although Henry Ford, he did not really invent the automobile, he was a very big part in the entrepreneur of bringing it into the world. So when we think, since the 1900s, he didn't invent the gasoline buggy, it says, but he was one of the most successful entrepreneurs in his field. Basically, because why? Why was he a great entrepreneur? Because he was practical in his mind. He had a great talent for organization and production. He had a large-scale, efficient operation that he developed, and he could bring forth 250,000 cars at a cost per unit far lower than the average cost per unit. That was his entrepreneurship. So since the 1900s, large-scale production is very important, not only in the automobile production, but in a lot of different productions of things. So it's a distinct part of the American economy. There's a vast national market of the United States. In fact, we have a huge market, 310 million consumers in our economy. So this is a large population in that point to get out the products, and the guarantee of producing efficiency. Well, it doesn't always depend on your large population, though, because in China and India, they have a large population, but their average worker produces far less than they do in America. Probably because they're under a command economy, right? Communism. But the American mass production market is a mass market, and it's a free enterprise. And so you have entrepreneurs that can bring forth this type of produce or goods on a mass market. But an industry or businesses may grow too big. Have you ever thought that? They may grow too big. So when you think of growing to a large scale, growing too big, how do you think of that? Well, here it says, productivity skyrocket at the Acme. Let's bring this down so you can see it. Let's see. Here, I guess you can read it. At the Acme Livestock Taming and China Factory, soon after the efficiency expert Professor Pinkelhammer recommended splitting the company into separate divisions. And well, here you have the chaos of it. So mass marketing can bring forth chaos at times, So in the midst. So let's go on. It says, and he shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water that bringeth forth his fruit in season. His leaf also shall not wither, and whatsoever he do shall prosper. So it's not just the mass production, because here we have some of these giant productions have been broken into smaller firms or have gone into bankruptcy. When the costs of operation have increased to those levels, but production and sales have not increased proportionally, the point has been reached where the firm has overexpanded. So at this point, management needs to take notice and act to alleviate this problem. So either the business ought to stop expanding, perhaps reducing its operations to a more manageable scale, or else develop better techniques of management, production, and scales. So some forms of economic activity are more efficient on small scales. Can you believe that? Yes, they are. Than on large ones. Large ones can make it more advantageous at certain times, but sometimes it's best to keep the firm small. For instance, a small, fashionable restaurant that serves excellent, high-priced food may be more profitable to its proprietor than a large cafeteria that serves just ordinary food at low prices to a crowd of customers. The advantages of remaining small apply to various forms of specialized manufacturing and distribution. It is chiefly in the manufacturing and distributing of standard goods to a mass market that large-scale production becomes efficient means of operation. Sometimes the division of labor is carried out too far. An entrepreneur may be so impressed with specialization that he thinks that one cannot have too much of a good thing. But that dividing of labor, as in the eating of chocolate bars, so you're eating these chocolate bars, there's a limit to how many chocolate bars you want to eat, right? The specialization is carried beyond the point of maximum efficiency. It becomes over-specialized. So that's what we're talking about now, is that over-specialization. So over-specialization, what is it? It's here. It's when specialization is carried out to the point beyond the maximum efficiency. So can you be less efficient by having more specialization? Yes, you can. It says to understand this concept, we can use Adam Smith's of pin making. Okay, let's talk about Adam Smith's pin making again. So Adam Smith, let's go down to here. Let's see if you can read it here. It's all the way through here, right? Adam Smith's pin making. So I'm going to kind of just skim over it. So Adam Smith employs 18 workers. For each one of them does one or two tasks in making the pins. And he breaks this down further into 9 steps. And then he decides, since he has 9 more steps, he's going to hire 9 more employees to specialize them. Now the pins require 27 specialized tasks instead of 18. So they use more employees and machines at a cost of 50% more labor than before. So after a few months, they look to see if they're going to have a 50% increase in sales, right? And they look and they only have a 25% increase in the money in sales, only 25%, and they thought they were going to have 50%. And their overall costs actually increased 40%. So the efficiency has declined. Too much specialization has happened. We don't want to go too far. So it may be no great demand for the pins. They may say, okay, we don't really need pins anymore very much. Or maybe they have new machines that have cost too much capital, or they have to pay so many more employees. Those things can affect this, we know. But they have now passed the point of efficient specialization. They are too over-specialized. And this cost of division of labor, of that not being repaid by the money, output money, so they are going backwards instead of forward. So you need to determine and examine the method of production, in the midst. They need to decide, really, do we need to be more specialized here, or do we need to be less specialized? So you're always examining your output to see what is happening. So specialization is great, but there can be a point of over specialization, and that's the point where it's not bringing in what it needs to be brought in production. So now we're going to go into section 7.5, and we have two more, this section and the last section here, and see if we can go through this quickly. But this is kind of fun. It's absolute and comparative advantage. So absolute advantage, so what is that? So absolute advantage is, right, here's the definition. It is the ability of one entity to produce goods or provide services more efficiently than his competitors when given the same resources. So let's go over it again. It's one entity is going to produce or provide services way more efficient than his competitors. He has the absolute advantage over everyone. So we go on to, now we're going to examine employees. So some have absolute advantage and some don't. So we're going to go with this example here of Bethany and Josh, okay? So Bethany is the best cashier. She's most efficient. She also can restock and rearrange the fruit and vegetable produce aisle very faster than anyone else, than any other employee. Bethany has absolute advantage over all the other employees in being a checker and being a stalker. So as she's stocking the shelves, she's doing well, and as she's working at the cash register, she is the best. But Josh is efficient too, but not nearly as efficient as she is. And he's very much slower in ringing up the groceries. And so Bethany absolutely is more efficient than Josh on both jobs, but supervisors focus on comparative advantage. So what is comparative advantage? Let's go down here. Bethany's supervisors focus on comparative advantage, which is the ability of an entity or person to produce a good or provide a service at an opportunity cost that is lower than that of another producer. So comparative. So the store's manager found the profits are highest when Bethany spends her time as cashier, and Josh, he stocks the shelves with the fruits and vegetables. So under this situation, we know that the opportunity of cost slightly is less efficient in the produce department, since Josh is not quite as good a stalker as Bethany. But if Josh and Bethany jobs were reversed, the opportunity cost would be much greater because Josh is much slower as a checker than Bethany. In other words, there is less of a difference between their efficiency in the produce department than there is in the cash registers. So, going on, here's what Colin Powell. There are no secrets to success. It is the result of preparation, hard work, and learning from failure. Amen. So, it says here, to clarify the difference between absolute advantage and comparative advantage, here's another example. So he's going to give us another example that we can look at. This other example, now we have, and here I'll show the pictures down here. It says, although one employee may be absolutely better than the others at doing several jobs, good supervisors will assign each worker to the area in which he is comparatively most efficient. So here we have. So in this case, we have Mr. Adams. He's really good at furniture making. And we have Mr. Bolin, and he's really good at raising chickens. And we have Miss Corelli, and she's really good at teaching children. Well, how good? Well, since Mr. Adams has the ability to produce the best furniture, but he raises chickens better than Mr. Bolin, and he also can teach children better than Miss Corella. So he's absolutely advantaged over all the other two. But should Mr. Adams do all three of these jobs? No. Just because he's best at all three, he can't do all three. So he must choose, he must have one job and stick with it and specialize in that one job. How to know which job to choose? Comparative advantage. Adams, Bolin, and Corelli are given grades on efficiency. Adams best does all three jobs, but most pronounced in furniture making. He has 50 points more. Adams has less advantage in chicken and raising kids, but Boland's better in chicken raising and then Corelli, Miss Corelli, and she remains with the teaching job. So we follow this all better as we're looking at the division of labor. So a person that's hiring has to figure out which is better. So here's the job efficiency. Let's look at the chart here. So we have furniture making efficiency, 100 points for Adams. Chicken raising 70, 80. See how far above? He's above. But here he's way above, so he's going to be our furniture maker. You can see. And then Bolin, Mr. Bolin here, he's better at chicken raising than his furniture anyway. So he likes chicken raising better anyway, so he ends up the chicken raiser. And then teaching, as we see Miss Corelli, she's the best at teaching. She doesn't really like doing the furniture making or chicken raising. So this is the job efficiency, how they figured out the job efficiency. And it has to do a lot about how good they are at that job, but how much they like that job. So we're going to also talk about, first of all, we're going to go on to another example. We're giving a lot of examples. You can see below here, see if you can see, with Acme Electric Company enjoys absolute advantage in making both fans and heaters because Acme is more efficient in making both products than Top Electric is. But because Top Electric does relatively better at some heaters than does other, then it will be able to do that comparatively, right? So again, comparative people or firms need to pay attention to comparative advantage. If they want to maximum their efficiency, it's very important that they can look at this. And we look at this chart of comparative advantage. Acme Electric Company enjoys absolute advantage. Top Electric does better at making heaters, you can see there. If Acme makes only fans and Top Electric makes only heaters, comparatively more efficient in making heaters than it is fans, the total product would be more efficient than if both of them decide to produce fans and heaters. So you can see here, both of them, if they both decide to produce fans and heaters, Acme, one situation, two firms divide their time and resources between fans and heaters, they can produce the following. But if each firm specializes spending their time on the production of the good at which they are most efficient, they have this. So Acme can produce 50 fans and 40 heaters. Top Electric's 25 fans and 30 heaters. And so that's their total product, 75 fans and 70 heaters. But if you look down here, if they decide to specialize, and Acme decides just to build fans, and Top Electric just to build heaters, they can produce more, because Acme is really good at producing fans, can produce 100 of them. And Top Electric's best at producing heaters and can produce 60 heaters. And so now their total product would be 160 instead of 70, a lot more. See how the specialization really helps in this situation. And you can see, this is the comparative. You can see the comparative as we're comparing Top Electric to its best. It's best at producing fans more than heaters best at producing heaters more than fans. So that's the comparative as you compare it. And you can see the absolute would be, absolutely, Acme is good at both of them. But in doing that, it will do better if it produces one. Because somebody's good at everything doesn't mean they can do everything, does it? So let's go on here to the next section. Geographic specialization and trade. So I'm going to kind of go through this quick, and this is going to be our last for this section. Geographic specialization and trade. Now we're going to be talking about nations. Trade among nations closely is connected to the division of labor too. So even when one has abundant resources, A nation will find itself economically ahead if it specializes in certain goods and then trades them with others instead of trying to produce everything itself the same way. One country says, well, I'm going to produce everything itself. Well, they're not going to be good at some things. So it's better to trade in that point. So geographic specialization right here. Here's the definition. So, which is the production of goods in which a country or region has absolute or comparative advantage, occurs when an area realizes that it is advantageous to produce different goods and to exchange these products for other areas. So basically a geographic specialization is something that they're absolutely advantaged in, or even comparative and absolute. They're top of the line. But it's going on, it says really to be advantageous is to be able to specialize in what you're really good at and then trade for your other goods, the other goods. So every region produces some goods better than other goods. A desert region, if you lived in the desert, what would you'd have to be really good at figs, producing figs or dates better than anyone else. Say that you lived in an Inuit village in the Arctic and you could cure seal skins and you can make ivory better than everyone. How about Switzerland? Well, since Switzerland, it's foolish to grow figs. There's no way you can grow figs or dates. There's no way you can hunt seals or make walruses' tusks or anything. So in Switzerland, you would have to profit by your banking industry, maybe, or maybe your precision goods, like you're really good in making watches or small machinery type things, So, or in Switzerland would be foolish to do those things. But now you have things that Switzerland that are good at. When a nation trades those items that produce best for goods from a country that produce other goods well, both nations benefit from the transaction. So here's a picture of a guy in Colombia harvesting coffee beans, which their country in Colombia is so good at producing coffee greens. So Adam Smith, who wrote The Wealth Nation, also wrote about this subject in the 1700s. And what does he say? In The Wealth of Nations, basically he says there's a benefit of international trade. He's saying benefit of it. Every master family, he says, every master family never attempts to make at home what it will cost him more to make than to buy. So if you can buy it cheaper, right? He's saying you don't have to make it at home if it's going to cost you so much to make it at home. So if you're going to, buy something, say that you're going to buy vegetables, is it going to be cheaper for you to buy them, or is it going to be cheaper for you to grow them? So that's what he's saying. If a foreign country can supply a commodity that is cheaper than we can make it, it's better to buy it. So if a foreign country says, I can actually buy it cheaper than I can make it here, I would rather buy it. But only left to find out the way in which it can be employed with greatest advantage. So it's important to know what is the greatest advantage, the industry. So certainly not an advantage when directed towards an object which it can buy cheaper than it can make. So that's basically saying, say you're in Florida and you're growing oranges. Are you going to buy oranges from Nebraska? I don't think so. So America's prosperity, one important of America's prosperity is the fact that within the immense trading area of the United States, geographic specialization has led to a greater abundance of goods at lower prices than if people in each state were compelled to produce for themselves all the things they wanted. So basically each state, we don't have tariffs between states. We don't have to pay taxes between states. States can freely trade. But there's some states that make things a lot better than in other states. And so, for an example, it says rice would be very costly to grow in Michigan, and apples would not flourish in Louisiana. And so here's another example, a big example. Here's a picture of the oranges in lower this so you can see it. The oranges and the wheat. So oranges and wheat. So oranges and wheat are both produced in Florida and Nebraska. But Florida has the absolute advantage in the orange production because the climate is better than for oranges there. Nebraska has the absolute advantage over Florida for wheat production. So both states gain if Florida produces the oranges and Nebraska cultivates the wheat, and then they trade on their trade on their market for each one. And so this is really efficient agriculture in the division of labor between states, and it happens in all of our states. So whenever there's no restrictions or penalties placed on the exchange of goods, the result is really good. It's a free trade market. And it can basically go across state lines now with no tariffs, so it is. Tariffs are taxes, remember, that must be paid for imported goods. But we don't have tariffs on our states, so that's a good thing in the United States of America. So let's go on from here. We're talking about free trade, of course. What is free trade? And those where no penalties are placed. Here's tariffs. Tariffs are taxes that must be paid on imported goods before they're allowed to enter, so we don't have the tariffs there. So let's go on to the next page. So going on, the Americans now, the situations now can be, a problem in international trade. So we're talking about international trade now. International trade can be very concerning in many points, because nations then are freely to import goods. And so say that we're going to import goods without tariffs or taxes, and another country is manufacturing these things at a lower price, it might put Americans out of business, right? And so they want to put tariffs so that we can protect our domestic producers. So if farmers are producing, wheat here, and then we are allowing importing wheat someplace else, and it seems cheaper, it may put our farmers out of business, which we don't want to do. But consumers benefit from free competition. So that means yes, but free competition is even good on a world level. So we have to weigh that between local and foreign manufacturers. There's some things that are a lot cheaper that we're going to be able to get from other countries. Yes, there are. So there's going to be that trade. There's going to be the idea politically how much taxes we should put on as bringing goods into our country from other countries, right? But all people will save money by lower prices, and goods would be invested in those in capital, and the market will go on, right? But ultimately, more money will be saved and more jobs will be created by allowing other countries to supply us with certain goods that we cannot produce as in our country. It would be very expensive to produce. Say that we wanted to produce molasses or something, or someplace from the south, as for importing from the south, these things. It might be better to import from South America certain things, so we have found that more cheap because we can't make certain things here as well. There are many cases, though, when it's not in best interest of the United States. What kind of cases are we talking about then? Well, some countries are notorious for breaking trade agreements anyway. They break agreements. They don't go by trade agreements at all. They could care less. And some countries devalue or inflate our currency a great deal. And they also counterfeit our money. They may be illegally depicting our copyright goods or inventions, or taking over or stealing our ideas. So when we think, they also may be seizing American assets and be very dishonest and damaging our economy in many ways. So we have to be very careful of foreign trade. Our country must be wary of all of this, because we have to say, is it an advantage to ban them or restrict them by tariffs or not? and it may be necessary for our government to regulate or place high tariffs on them, to regulate, their the way they do their business. So in some situations there may be even moral problems, a moral obligation to avoid trading with certain nations. We're not going to trade with this nation. We shouldn't really trade with China as we do, because of what they do to their own people and the atrocities they put on their people, and even child labor and all these other things in the communist society. So some governments commit atrocities against their own people, and so we can say we're not going to buy from them. Or some that go against biblical principles altogether. We just say, well, we're not going to really buy from them. Our nation should not condone or support nations whose leaders are involved in genocide. So what's genocide? Genocide is the systematic killing of groups of people. Or we should not be buying from countries that are persecuting Christians, or countries that have slaves labor, or they're abusing people. We should stay away from buying things from these countries or supporting these countries in any way, right? So that is another important. So it says, except the Lord build the house, they that labor in vain that build it. Except the Lord keep the city, the watchman waketh in vain. So it's important when you look, as there are many cases that's not in our best interest to seek free trade with these other countries. So all of those things. So we cannot let the trading with it damage our sovereignty and our national security, and trust in the Lord too. I think it all comes down to trusting the Lord. And we should not allow our trading policies that undermine our safety, so of our citizens. So we don't want to have unrestricted freedom of our security secrets, and selling our secrets and selling our equipment that we have, or our technology, to countries that would use it in war times against us. So we must should not allow other nations to gain military advantage over us. So, and it goes another example here. Let's see. This is all on this, but next page. Here we go. Here's the situation we're talking about. So Americans faced a crisis in the early 1970s with Arab oil. I think this Arab oil crisis had a lot to do with, because we had supported Israel, and they're totally at that time against Israel. So, but otherwise, the Arab embargo, the Arabs decided to not sell us in 1970s oil. So the producers raised their oil prices in the Arab oil, and refused to sell to the United States. And this caused this whole event. And it may not have ever occurred if we had demonstrated earlier the ability to supply our own oil. So this happened, giving us a lesson. Maybe we should have got our oil from Alaska, right? Instead of the Arab nations, So if we could have provided our own oil, we wouldn't have had an oil crisis, is what they're saying. So the whole event may not have happened, even though later on the Arabs had barrels of oil and they decided to sell us oil again, right? But we should beware and be ready to change our policies in some of these trade agreements with countries that are very unpredictable, So the conclusion here is, while it is theoretically beneficial to encourage free trade between countries, there are many situations in which government is justified in restricting it too. So that's the conclusion. We can trade with these countries, but we have to be wary of them, that's for sure, because some of them are not based biblically on morality at all. So that's the end of this section.